Hello, I'm Michael Bates, and this is my garden. It's about 10 miles north of San Francisco as the crow flies, and about 1,000 feet above sea level. I make a point of where I live because knowing your climate and its vagaries, heat, cold, rainfall patterns, relative humidity, plays a big role in gardening. It tells you what you can expect to do well and what you can't from the myriad of plants available to you. It's been a lesson for me personally because, as you can probably tell, my horticultural teeth were cut in a country where it rains persistently throughout the summer. Here in California, on the other hand, hardly a drop falls between May and October. So before mailing off your order form for those gorgeous perennials you saw in that glossy catalogue, you may save yourself a lot of anguish and disappointment later on if you bone up on the climate in your area or consult with your local nursery. To make things a little easier, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has established a plant hardiness zone map, which tells you the optimum temperature ranges for 10 different zones of the U.S. You'll frequently run across these zonal references in books and magazines, so it pays to know about the growing climate for your own zone. The next point, and this is one that many people have difficulty with, is the question of plant names. While some plants have common names, such as columbine and daylily, many don't. But all plants are known by a botanical name, and these are based on Latin. And believe me, some can be a mouthful. But don't be put off. You'll also discover that plants are invariably described by the use of two words. The first word describes the genus or group, such as Campanula and Salvia. The second word indicates the species. This will often be a word that describes the plant, such as officinalis, meaning medicinal, or sempervirens, meaning evergreen. Once you get the hang of botanical names, they can tell you a lot about the individual plants. The name may indicate the color, such as alba, meaning white, or rubens and ruba, meaning red. The name may indicate a characteristic of the plant, such as reptans, which means creeping, or the plant's leaf form, as in angustifolius, which means narrow or lance-shaped. The name can also tell you the plant's country of origin, as in chinensis from China, or borealis, meaning from the north. After a while, you'll become comfortable pronouncing them, and more importantly, learn to appreciate them for the information they provide. Let's establish what we mean by the name perennial, as it applies to the plant world. Essentially, perennial describes a plant that will live and bloom for more than 2 growing seasons. It's not uncommon for some perennials to survive 10 years or even more. After all, peonies are often said to outlive their owners. You may be saying, well, are trees and shrubs perennials then? The answer is no. Trees and shrubs are excluded from the perennial plant world because they have woody stems and branches. Perennials are classified as herbaceous plants, meaning that they all have soft tissue and non-woody stems. Would that life and botany were that simple. There are a few perennials, like foxgloves and Canterbury bells, that have a short 2-year growing season, but then set seed to replace the parent plant, and we include these as perennials too. In my own garden, I like to mix things up a bit, so I plant perennials in amongst roses and shrubs for structure, and bulbs and annuals to create a medley effect. But let's take a look at some gardens where perennials have been skillfully and sometimes casually planted to create varying kinds of effects. The next subject you can't afford to overlook if you want to grow good, healthy perennials is establishing the right type of soil. The best gardeners I know to give good advice in this department are Daria and Bruce Shanks over at Cottage Garden Growers near the town of Petaluma. Over the years, they've planted literally thousands of perennials, and there's not much they don't know about soil.
Hello, I'm Daria Shanks. My husband Bruce and I own Cottage Garden Growers of Petaluma. At any given time during the growing season, we stock over 40,000 perennials. As Michael said, knowledge of soil structure and conditioning is imperative to growing perennials. Soil is composed of three mineral elements: clay, which has the smallest mineral particles, hence the most dense; sand, which has much larger particles, allowing for more air, thus making it drain and warm up more quickly; and silt, which has mineral particles about half the size of fine sand. The proportions or percentages that each of these minerals combine to create your soil will determine the soil's texture and its growing potential. Soil with too high a percentage of sand in it will be too loose, and conversely, soil with an excess of clay will be too heavy and slow draining to encourage good plant growth. The best kind of soil is one that is well balanced. This is usually referred to as loam or loamy soil. The other critical part of the soil equation is the organic matter that is part of the soil's composition. The organic material can come from a variety of sources, such as decomposed plant matter or varying types of manures. These provide nutrition, moisture retention, and improved drainage, all essential to healthy plant growth. Because these organic materials are continually decomposing, they must be replaced from time to time. There's one last characteristic of soil that can't be ignored, and that is what is called the pH factor. This is simply a measurement of the soil's acidity or alkalinity. The pH scale goes from 1 to 14 with a reading of 7 as neutral. Below 7, the soil becomes progressively more acidic, and above 7, more alkaline. As a rule of thumb, most perennials will be perfectly happy with a soil pH of 6.5 to 7. While you can change soil pH by adding organic materials such as potassium, phosphate, or nitrogen, and adding modest amounts of these is acceptable, I strongly recommend the practice of finding plants to suit your existing soil rather than changing it to suit your plants.
One of the most important considerations in growing perennials, and this is true of all plants really, is to know which of them require full sun to flourish and which will grow happily with less sunshine or even partial shade. Since one of the better ways of gardening with perennials is to plant them in groups of varying kinds, it's also critical to know not only the amount of sunlight that individual plants will require, but equally important to recognize the sunny and shady areas of your garden. For example, growing foxgloves, which need a shady spot, alongside salvias, most of which do best with full exposure to the sun, can't hope to bring out the best of both plants. The direction in which your garden faces, the positioning of fences, walls, and hedges will all have a bearing on the amount of sun that can be expected during different times of the day and of the year. For example, a garden that faces east will get morning sun, which is not as warm as midday or afternoon sun. This graphic will help indicate the degrees of sun and shade exposure depending on your garden's orientation. So search out compatible perennial plants that will thrive in the various light and shade conditions that exist in your garden. There's literally thousands to choose from. Let's take a close-up look at some of the most popular summer perennials, ones that can be grown in most states. To establish height, spread, and the growth habit of these plants, refer to the plant list that's included with your video. One of the country's leading authorities on perennial plants is Sarah Hammond. As luck would have it, Sarah lives and gardens about 25 miles from here, on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean in the little town of Bolinas. Getting there is part of the fun because the route takes us through some of the prettiest countryside in Northern California. Sarah has a wealth of experience and lots of creative ideas on how to use perennials in a variety of different landscape situations. Let's go and take a look.
I'm Sarah Hammond. This is my garden. I've been gardening all my life. I started when I was a very small child. I've been enjoying perennials for the last 15 years, and to the point where now I garden probably 90% of the plants in my garden are perennials. I've been bringing them over from England slowly through the years, and I've been spending the last few years learning really how to grow them well, which I think is very important. Many people ask me why I so enjoy gardening with perennials. I think for their endless variety, beautiful possibility of combinations, their form, the fact that they're ever changing in a year. There's always something coming to the fore and something fading. I'm very much playing in my own garden with these combinations and successions, and I think perennials offer a very wonderful opportunity to play at gardening. Michael has spoken a bit about the importance of light and shade. Another very important factor, of course, is the eventual size and shape of a plant. Many plants, when one purchases them in a garden center, are very small, and you plant them and you expect them to be a mound of about a foot, which can then, of course, in a season spread to a much greater size. Take a ridgeron, for example. When one plants one, it's a little small expression which, just given a short period of time, can spread quite alarmingly to quite some size, can almost take over your garden if you let it. What I do in my garden with the ridgeron is give it an occasional good chop, taking it down almost to the ground, and then it immediately comes back into its original shape. At that time, you often need to weed out the little small plants that have formed around it. You can use those in other parts of the garden, but the idea is to maintain the nice, concise shape that you want to have in the garden. Another example is Nepeta. The plant I'm holding is Nepeta cross fascinii. It starts as a nice mound, but over time will begin spreading to the point where you will need to divide it and make a number of plants from it, which naturally produces these borders, such as you see here in my garden, the division of one innocent plant into many. Many people new to perennial gardening tend to focus largely on the flower. They'll buy a plant in a nursery when it is in flower, and therefore overlooking frequently one of the joys in perennial gardening is the beauty of the texture, the color, the shape of leaves, the texture of the plant also in its overall expression. For example, there are lovely copper. I'm holding a piece of Anthriscus sylvestris, raven's wing, a beautiful burgundy, russet tones that you can get in the leaves, or of course the wonderful realm of silver and gray plants in perennials. It's a big mistake to only consider the color. One of the combinations I enjoy very much in my garden is the silvery leaves of Artemisia as a foil for white iceberg roses or any pure white flowers. I think they're set off very beautifully by the silveriness of Artemisia. Another example would be Santolina, the gray mounds of Santolina. I don't permit the yellow buttons to flower, of course, but the repeat mounds of gray are a lovely adjunct to old roses and many other perennials. It gives a certain form to them. I intend in the future to do a whole border of sort of darker leafed plants, perennials that are remarkable for their coppery burgundy leaves. Many perennials make wonderful container subjects. A good thing to remember is that you can grow a perennial just for 1 year only, although it will live on. It's more beautiful in the first year. Frequently they will get too big for a container in the second year, but they give you months and months of beauty with only a little bit of tending. And then when they've gotten too large, you can certainly plant them out in your garden. Here's an example. I planted a small Saponaria osmoides in this large urn in my garden, and because it only blooms once in a season, I planted at its feet in the ground in a circular fashion a Teucrium comedries. When the Saponaria osmoides is finished its 2 or 3 months of bloom, I simply cut it back and it makes a wonderful green mound at the top, and then the Teucrium takes up the flowering aspect of the combination at its feet. This then extends the season for some months of some floral interest. Another example is an urn I planted with Convolvulus sabatius, also known as Convolvulus mauritanicus, which flowers most of the summer beautifully, sometimes well into the late autumn. Then I've planted an urn, a stone urn with campanula, a low campanula, which soon filled the urn, and I've had a great abundance of being able to dig pieces of that out and put it in other planters. And here are some other examples of perennials grown in containers. I'm frequently asked to recommend perennials that will do well in shade. Here's a handful that I'm very fond of that do well in containers, not only for their flowers, which come later, but for the beauty of the leaf, the patterns, the colors of the leaves. Very fine in containers in the shade. Here are a few more thoughts on plants for containers. Heliotrope, very nice leaf texture with this Euphorbia cyparissius, which does have chartreuse flowers later in the summer, but even before it blooms, one can exploit the beauty of its foliage. Heuchera Pallas purple has wonderful contrast at the bottom of the leaves, does have a spray of flowers, but again is most beautiful for its leaves. A nice contrast would be the Euphorbia amygdaloides rubra here, which again flowers, but is just equally beautiful when it's still in leaf. A very nice campanula for containers is this Pochorskiana type, which is rather slower growing than the others, and it's this one is called Blue Gown. Behind it is a entirely perennial foxglove, Digitalis mertenensis, which gives long beauty in a container. This is Corydalis flexuosa China Blue, which is somewhat contained by a container, of course, because it tends to ramble in the garden. It has very fragrant blue flowers for many months. And a very nice adjunct to others is this other plants in a container, if you choose to put several together, is the Glaucoma hederatia variegata, very nice in window boxes and containers like that. These are all shade-loving perennials in containers.
The easiest and by far the most popular way to buy perennials is in plastic containers. These vary in size from small 6-packs and 4-inch containers like these, up to 15-gallon containers for very large plants. The advantage of this method is that the plant comes with the roots already established and the whole thing can go in the ground with a minimum of disturbance. Planting potted perennials is really quite simple, but there are steps to make the process easier and help get your plants off to a good start. Daria and Bruce will show you how they do it at Cottage Garden Growers.
We're going to plant this 1-gallon penstemon, but the procedure is the same for any size container. Dig a hole to the same depth as the pot in which your plant is growing. Partly fill it with water and wait until the water drains out. If it doesn't, you have to dig deeper and introduce some gravel to the bottom of the hole to improve drainage. If you sense that the soil in the pot is dry, give the plant a light watering and wait for a few minutes. This helps to hold the soil together when you remove the plant. Turning the pot sideways, slip the plant carefully out of the pot, retaining as much of the soil as possible. If the plant resists, turn the pot upside down and gently tap the rim of the pot on a nearby hard surface to jog the plant out. In doing so, place one hand under the top of the pot, with fingers spread around the plant's stem to prevent the soil from falling out. When the plant is free, loosen up the root ball around the sides and bottom with your fingers. This will help acclimate the plant to its new location more quickly. Regardless of what type of soil you have, it's a good idea to add some kind of amendment to it before you plant. The reason for this is to create a transition zone between the soil the plant was grown in and your own soil. Place the plant in the hole so that the top of the container's soil is flush with the top of the soil in the bed. Then backfill around the plant, pressing down with your hands, not with your feet. Water the plant again, and, this is important, apply mulch around the base of the plant. Mulching your plants with any kind of organic matter will conserve moisture, discourage weeds, and often provide nutrients.
One of the real beauties of perennial plants is that new ones can be started by a process called propagation. This is both a simple and economical way to increase the stock of plants from your own garden by reproducing from those that you already have or from those of friends. It costs virtually nothing. Daria and Bruce will show you how they do it.
There are three types of propagating techniques. The first one that I'd like to discuss is that of seed. There are many perennials that can be propagated quite easily from seed. The columbine, the Aquilegia, produces a nice big fat seed head, and ideally when it's ripe, it splits open and produces these nice shiny little black seeds. Another one that is quite readily available from seed, and that's of the viola. This is Viola labradorica, and it'll produce a nice big seed head. And if you split that open, you can see all the little tiny seeds in there. The third one that I'd like to demonstrate is that of Helleborus orientalis, the Lenten rose, which blooms early spring. It produces nice big fat seed heads, and as they ripen, they'll split open and drop their seed. Here's one that has already done it. We've collected quite a few of these. They're really nice big seed heads. And what you want to do is take them and sow them on top of a well-drained potting soil. And when they're all down, you might want to firm them in, get them seated in there. And then what you want to do is lightly cover them. Try not to bury them too deep. You're just trying to cover the top of them. Give it a little water. And then what I like to do, so you don't have to keep watering it every time it dries out, is cover it with a plastic bag, which will keep the humidity up and kind of create a little greenhouse. And put that in a well-lit area and watch it grow. The second form of propagating that I'd like to discuss is that of taking cuttings. And what you want to do here is take the tender new growth of the plant you're propagating. In this case, it's Garland Heimeri. And what you want to do is strip off the lower leaves. You can either use your nail or cut them off. And what I like to do is also cut the top. What you want to do is eliminate a lot of the surface area. And then you want to put it into a rooting hormone. This one is dissolved in water. In taking cuttings, you can take as many as you want. This is the way that many plants at a nursery are propagated, because you can take an awful lot. You don't want to take a cutting that has a flower forming on it, because then it's at the wrong stage. When you're done, you're going to want to stick them in. In this case, this is a vermiculite mix, which is a spongy, absorbing material that water soaks into. Using a pencil, poke the holes in. When you stick them in, I bury them about 1 inch deep. When they're in, go ahead and firm them in. Get them seated in nicely. Now, I've already wet this down. So at this stage, what I like to do is use the bag again. By covering it up, you're creating that greenhouse effect. And the way you water it, by putting it in a saucer, you fill the saucer with water. And I've put a fair amount in, and what will happen now is the water will wick up and keep the soil medium continuously moist. So you really, all you have to do is keep the saucer filled with water. After about 2 weeks, the roots should have formed. And what you do at that point, you end up with a plant that has a nice root system to it. And at this stage, you get your pot with a nice potting soil in it, and a little hole, stick it in, and now you have a new plant. The third form of propagating is that of division, and it's probably the most satisfying. What I have here is a yarrow that is extremely root bound to the point where I have to literally cut it out of its pot. The first thing that you do when you want to divide is to cut, in this case, all of the foliage off. I like to say that to divide, you have to have the skill of a surgeon, but the mentality of a butcher. In this case, I'm using a kitchen knife, but if you're digging up perennials in your garden, you could very easily divide them with a pitchfork or a spade if they're big. The first thing you do is you slice the bottom off. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quarter it. But if you wanted to, you could literally make numerous plants out of this one plant here. If you're going to do it in the garden, you have 3 nice new plants here. In this case, I'm going to pot this one up into a planter. And there we have yet another new plant.
On the subject of watering, a good general rule to follow is to water deeply but infrequently, causing the water to penetrate the soil deeply and thereby making the roots penetrate deeply also, rather than just a surface wetting, which might make you feel cool, but it's not at all good for the plants. Another good rule is to combine plants of similar water needs together, thirst needs. Having said that, I break my own rules by frequently using the drought-tolerant Mediterranean plants as foil for some of the thirstier old roses and some of the perennials that do need more water. As to feeding, a wonderful English garden writer once said, "Plants like people like to be warm and well fed." So it's a great mistake to think that your perennial will go on performing for you without a really good diet, which frequently should include, or always should include, minerals. The component of minerals, along with whatever compost you might be using on top of a very good soil to begin with, is all important in maintaining the health of your perennials. I'm sometimes accused of being a somewhat obsessive deadheader. Deadheading being the removal of the spent flowers on a perennial. And it seems that a gardener spends much of the summer deadheading plants. The reason being, if you fail to deadhead, the plant stops blooming. And we will all want to have the maximum bloom out of our perennials, so the removal of the spent flowers is very important. Sometimes, as in the case of the salvia, it's only necessary to cut off just the first part that has bloomed, enabling the others to bloom around it. After they're finished, you may want to go down clear to the bottom of the plant and cut at ground level. These are some of the perennials I enjoy midsummer in my garden. The Achillea Salmon Beauty, which I like to keep deadheaded, meaning that I remove the flowers that are beginning to fade so that I have the nice effect of a deeper color, the salmon color, through much of the summer. It blooms for a very long time. Here is the Lavandula Martha Broderick, wonderful full long blooming lavender of the angustifolia type. Another lavender of which I'm very fond is the dwarf Lavandula Hidcote. Here by the rose Penelope, the hybrid musk, is Ballata acetabulosa, of which I'm very fond because it's actually blooming now, but it looks more like just a mass of foliage, which is, I think, a welcome relief when you have much color around you. It's nice to have little islands of things that are not such a strident bloom. And another Lavandula Martha Roderick here with a Stachys byzantina, the flowering lamb's ear, which I like very much to keep just a few spikes of bloom. If you let it go, it almost flowers too much. Of course, in front, the Nepeta cross fascinii, one of my favorite plants because it makes such a lovely edging across things. And interrupted there with a Geranium sanguineum, one of the cranesbills. Over here, another cranesbill, the true geranium, called Johnson's Blue, which blooms midsummer and is very nice associating with silver foliage, I think. Another plant that I enjoy very much midsummer is the Salvia nemorosa East Friesland. It's particularly nice to grow underneath roses. The mounding plants here are Convolvulus neorum, the bush morning glory with silvery foliage, and many mounds here that I have come to grow because I have quite a windy garden much of the year. I clip into tight mounds, partly Santolina camasiparissus and Santolina ericoides. I keep them clipped because I don't really like the bright yellow flowers very much, and at the same time, by clipping it frequently, I keep tight mounds that the wind just howls over. It doesn't really harm the garden. Over here I have Geranium sanguineum, a bit strident color, but I love it very much in relation to the purple smoke tree, which provides a nice foil, which I stool, a technique that's cutting a plant to the height of a stool and living with the fresh new foliage every year. This lavandula is called Goodwin Creek, long blooming lavender. Here I have a Portugal laurel, Though not a perennial, I like to include a dark green backdrop to show off many of the flowering plants in my garden, particularly nice when backlit, I think, the flowers with that dark green behind them. And in the foreground is a favorite hybrid musk rose of mine. I always grow amidst my perennials. It's called Felicia. There's no end to the pleasure I've received in my gardening life with perennials, these beautiful, generous creatures. And they give so much for so little. Particularly now there's no end to the pleasure because so many new perennials are showing up on the gardening scene all the time, both being imported from other countries and chance seedlings and sports that show up in our own gardens. So it's an endless delight and of great interest to go on learning how to grow them and combine them and absolutely delight in them. I encourage you to do likewise.
Gardening with perennials is a lot of fun and can be a very rewarding pastime. There are thousands from which to choose, all different shapes, sizes, colors, and leaf interest. Many of them still grow in the wild, exactly the same as the form as you find them in gardens today, and in just about every part of the world. So whether you fancy an old-fashioned cottage-style garden, perhaps a more formal garden, maybe a woodland area or a simple rock garden, there's a world of perennials out there ready to explore. And if you don't have a garden at all, consider planting perennials in containers. Whatever your gardening style, there's absolutely no question that it will be enhanced and enriched with the beauty and sheer joy that summer perennials provide. Come on, Hopi.